offered by Representative Mark Mustio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary.
Good morning, Representative.
Good morning. My goal is to try and fill that gap, the structural deficit, and with my questions. We've had several agencies come in front of us, and your office was kind enough to provide to our committee some of the answers, complaining about their increased allocation for their workers' compensation charges. And I'm taken back to the October 28, 2015 press release from the LCB, where they say, additionally, the Commonwealth's new insurance examiner determined the Commonwealth as a whole had been insufficiently contributing to its self-funded workers' compensation liability and increased the total liability for the fund from $160 million to $860 million, roughly, rounding numbers. So that's a $700 million increase. My first question is, of the structural deficit that you're citing, how much of that $700 million are you attributing to that?
All right, I don't think those I don't think those numbers are quite accurate. We did in a more recent actuarial analysis make a determination that our outstanding workers' comp, long-term workers' comp liability was much more substantial than had been previously anticipated. The downside for the LCB, if you will, is that two changes were made, one of which you've already alluded to, but even more significantly for the LCB. In the prior administration, they had made a decision at the near the end of the administration to change the way we apportion workers' compensation costs or liabilities across state agencies. We're continuing to take a look at whether that was the right decision to make, but that is currently what is in place. And what I mean by that is that the experience rating of each agency is now an individual determination. Previously, whatever that workers' comp liability had been determined to be on an annual basis, all agencies essentially paid the same rate.
Right.
Now we look individually at the experience rating of an individual agency.
And I'm not challenging that. My question was, first of all, you sort of implied to me that that $700 million increase wasn't accurate.
It was about $200 million, as I remember off the top of my head. We'll get the details for what the previous estimate had been and then what the revised estimate was.
And when was the revised estimate made? Do you know the date?
Well, this was done, you alluded to an October letter. That estimate had been made earlier in the calendar year. We had several meetings sitting down with the LCB to work through with them a number of different accounting changes, if you will, that did affect essentially their bottom line. It was just not the workers' comp issue. There were also some federal accounting changes for how we report and how they have to assign liabilities that also affected their balance sheet.
Right, and I'm not specifically addressing their balance sheet. I was specifically addressing the comment, which many of the other agencies came in too, specifically alluding to the workers' compensation charge. And the reason I bring that up, and the allocation model is interesting, but really it doesn't tell you anything unless you're comparing the actual losses to the allocations. So some of the responses that were made to our staff here, agencies are taking steps to improve workplace safety and reduce claims, which will impact future rates. Well, it's my understanding that the Commonwealth has had the same safety and loss prevention vendor, in place for at least the last 5 years. For years, the total employment has been coming down. So I guess my concern is that we have these numbers that are able to fluctuate by hundreds of millions of dollars. We had the same situation several years ago with the Pennsylvania School Boards Association playing games with reserves, which ends up establishing a cash fund here. Then we maybe possibly could come in years later with another actuarial study and reduce the reserves, but we have all this cash. So that's what I'm trying to prevent from happening. And I'm not accusing your budget department of doing it, but you're relying on numbers that within the last 6 months have gone from a $700 million increase down to a $200 million increase. And that raises a lot of questions, And I'm glad you asked them to get the reduction.
Well, again, I want to emphasize that the delta is clearly not the magnitude that you're citing, but we'll provide you with those precise estimates, both what the prior actuarial estimate had been and what the revised actuarial estimate now is. And again, these are estimates of future liability. We have to take a hard look at what the underlying assumptions are and make our best estimate about whether those underlying assumptions are accurate or not. The conservative nature that I would bring to the office wants to make sure that we have appropriately and fully accounted for what our future workers' compensation liabilities are. I mean, we all know the sad tale of woe in our pension system and what happens when we don't make the best actuarial estimates or don't fully fund future obligations and let those obligations simply grow or that debt loom larger in future years. But to your point, there is no intention, I assure you, to creating any unwarranted fund balance. We want to make sure that we provide adequate funds to meet those liabilities and nothing more.
And I want to be clear that I wasn't making the assertion that you and your department was doing that.
Sure.
But sometimes when you rely on outside vendors and without knowing how they're compensated or what their ultimate goals and mission is, particularly when some of them have been in place for years, establishing the support that created an unfunded liability at a certain level, now all of a sudden it significantly increases. That raises a lot of red flags.
Right.
I mean, I spend a lot of my evenings reading reserving ratios and claim reports and things like that. I have a boring life, okay? And so when I saw those numbers, that was an immediate red flag. It was the same red flag that came to me with the School Boards Association that when they were overcharging our school districts by millions of dollars. So I appreciate the dialogue. We can get, if you would be so kind, to have a dialogue with the committee to get us the specifics so that we could review those, we could work together to maybe fill some of these holes.
No, we certainly appreciate that. We welcome that input, and we'll be happy to do that. It was a new actuary, and that's what often happens when you bring fresh eyes to provide that perspective.
Let's go to the old actuary and save a couple $100 million.